China scraps some of its most controversial COVID rules. Experts warn of dark days ahead. Amid a weakening economy, Apple decides to reduce iPhone production in China. And more coming up on today's episode of China Explained. After 3 long years of the strictest COVID lockdowns seen anywhere around the world, China has finally decided to relax some of the regulations. China has announced sweeping changes to its zero-COVID policy. This is the most notable turnaround in national policy since the start of the pandemic. In a statement provided by CCTV, the Chinese state-run media company, the CCP has come up with 10 guidelines that loosen the restrictions. First, the QR codes that were an essential part of the enforcement policy for zero-COVID have been scrapped. That does not mean that the Chinese government has let go of all the tracking methods that they have implemented. It just means that people no longer have to rely on their health codes to visit public places and use public transport. If you are not aware of the QR codes and their implementation, let me give you a gist of what they mean. Since the early days of the pandemic, CCP has used health codes to track individuals and their health status. This was done by assigning individuals a color, which were red, yellow, and green, through which the decision was made to allow individuals to leave their homes, use public transport, and enter public spaces, or potentially quarantine in a government quarantine center, which in essence is a jail that you'll be put into and pay for from your pocket. Under the new rules, people will be allowed most public spaces without having to show a negative test result or the QR, which is a significant step in returning people's lives to some semblance of normalcy. But employers and business owners are still free to demand negative test results. Although there are a few restrictions for places like nursing homes, medical institutions, and secondary schools where showing a negative test result is mandatory. The CCP is also allowing infected people with mild or no symptoms to quarantine at home. Throughout the pandemic, Chinese citizens have suffered more than most when they were forced into quarantine camps where they complained about unsanitary conditions, lack of food, and not knowing when they were going to be let out. And if the people locked in these camps were not able to accumulate the funds that were needed to pay for the stay, they were trapped indefinitely. Now, if a patient's condition deteriorates drastically, then they will be transferred to hospitals for treatment. The new guidelines also urge authorities to ensure the normal functioning of society and basic medical services, saying areas that aren't designated high risk should not restrict people's movements or close businesses. Lockdowns are now only allowed in high-risk areas, and even then, they have to be lifted if no new cases are reported for 5 consecutive days. Authorities are also urged to not block fire escapes and entrances to buildings or other entrances so residents can still evacuate in the case of an emergency. This particular guideline comes after a fatal fire in Xinjiang, where the firefighters were not able to reach the fire because of draconian lockdown measures, which triggered the recent waves of protests. The State Council on Wednesday also emphasized the need to accelerate COVID vaccination among the elderly, saying all locations should be administering as many vaccinations as possible. So a new vaccination plan has also been rolled out for the most at-risk group, of whom around 2/3 are vaccinated, but only 40% have received booster shots. Some new rules have also been implemented, like schools with COVID outbreaks are asked to continue as normal, and people are allowed to travel domestically. Perhaps reflecting public concern that the relaxation in rules could cause a surge in cases, residents have rushed to drugstores, with reports last week that cold and fever medicines were flying off the shelves. Some experts also share this sentiment that China is underprepared for the surge in cases it could now see. Experts say that much is still unknown about the next few months and how the CCP will react to it, as even a small number of severe cases amongst the vulnerable and unvaccinated can result in hospitals being overwhelmed. The timing of the relaxation couldn't be much worse, as this is also the start of flu season, which the CCP didn't plan for. As restrictions are relaxed and the virus spreads across the country, China is going to have to go through a period of pain in terms of illness, serious illness, deaths, and stress on the healthcare system, as was seen elsewhere in the world earlier in the pandemic. As China continues to struggle with the pandemic and the potential struggle that lies ahead with the overburdened healthcare system, it faces a much more pressing issue, which is the slump in production and global demand. China's economy lost more steam in November as factory output and retail sales, both missing the forecast and showing their worst reading in the past, made worse by the surge of COVID cases and the widespread virus curbs. Data suggested further deterioration in economic conditions as lockdowns are still present in some cities. And who can forget the collapse of the property sector, bungled with the weakening of global demand, pointing to a bumpy road ahead. Industrial output rose by 2.2% in November compared to the previous year, missing expectations of 3.6%. Retail sales have fallen by 5.9% amid broad-based weakness in the service sector, which also is the biggest contraction since May. Analysts also predict consumption to shrink by 3.7%. Sales in the contract-intensive catering sector fell 8.4% from a year earlier. Meanwhile, automobile production fell by 9.9%. All the data is provided by the Chinese government, so it is to be taken with a grain of salt, and the reality could be much worse. To combat this, China's central bank wrapped up cash injections into the banking system and held interest rates on a medium-term policy to keep liquidity conditions ample. Property investment fell by almost 20% year-on-year, which is the fastest since the Statistics Bureau began compiling the data in year 2000. What all this means is that a policy change is desperately needed to retrieve the growth momentum. This is made even worse as Apple looks to other countries to redirect supply amid fears of overdependence on China. Since the mayhem that erupted in the Foxconn megafactory in Jingzhou, there have been significant delays for the latest iPhone models at the year's end, which is Apple's busiest season, putting at risk the 14th quarter growth streak. The crisis has highlighted the cost of doing business in China and its zero-COVID policy, which the CCP is scrambling to unwind, which added to the tech giant's urgency to reroute supply chains as almost 90% of the components are supplied from China. Apple is accelerating to have more of its new products elsewhere, especially Vietnam and India. China's dominant position in Apple's supply chain has gradually waned in recent years. Until 2019, China was the primary location of about 44 to 47% of Apple's suppliers' production sites. China's shares fell to 41% in 2020 and then 36% in 2021. Apple is looking to diffuse supply chain risks and is leaning to further diversify its supply chain. But this will not be easy for Apple, as China facilitates on-demand access to a vast pool of migrant workers, allowing assembly lines to swell to 1 million workers in peak season and shrink to a fraction of that number during quiet periods. China's industrial cluster also helps Apple, as suppliers are willing to partner with Apple for less money, as they are willing to learn from Apple's supply chain prowess, and in turn, win more contracts from domestic companies, aiming to mirror Apple's success. Conditions are worsened by geopolitical tensions over self-ruled Taiwan, which Beijing claims as its territory that must be reunified, by force if necessary, adding to the complicated mix of factors influencing Apple's outlook for China. If the Chinese economy wasn't suffering enough, it is made even worse by Washington, as the U.S. Trade Representative's office said on Friday that it'll be extending China's Section 301 tariff exclusion for another 9 months on 352 Chinese import product categories that were set to expire at the end of 2022. In prior notices, the U.S. Trade Representative modified the actions in the Section 301 investigation of China's acts, policies, and practices related to technology transfer, intellectual property, and innovation by excluding from additional duties certain medical care products needed to address COVID, and subsequently extended certain of these exclusions. The current COVID exclusions cover 81 medical care products that are scheduled to expire on November 30, 2022. This notice announces that the U.S. Trade Representative's determination to further extend the 81 COVID exclusions for an additional 3 months. In light of the continuing efforts to combat COVID, the U.S. Trade Representative has determined that a 3-month extension of the 81 COVID-related product exclusions is warranted. The U.S. Trade Representative's decision to extend the 81 product exclusions takes into account public comments previously provided, the advice of advisory committees and the Interagency Section 301 Committee, and the advice of the White House COVID-19 response team. If this were not hard enough for the CCP to deal with, the U.S. State Department on Friday launched its long-planned China House Unit, an internal reorganization to help expand and sharpen its policymaking towards its geopolitical rival. Secretary of State Anthony Blinken, in May, announced the creation of China House, calling it a department-wide integrated team that will coordinate and implement U.S. policy across issues and regions. China House will bring together China experts from throughout the department to coordinate with every regional bureau and experts in the international security, economics, technology, multilateral diplomacy, and strategic communications. The statement quoted Blinken as saying, "It will be replacing the Department of China desk, but will continue to be run by Rick Walters." While China's relationship with the U.S. seems to be deteriorating, it has made a new friend in the geopolitical stage in the form of Saudi Arabia. Saudi ministry announced that they will soon start teaching Chinese language and literature in educational institutions as part of their curriculum, according to an agreement signed by the Saudi Arabian and Chinese governments. An educational professor told Arab News that learning Chinese will also promote trade relations between the two countries. The idea of introducing the Chinese language into the curriculum was first introduced by Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman in 2019. An assistant professor at King Abdulaziz University said, "Everyone is well aware of the international trend for learning the Chinese language, even in developed countries where politicians are proud of their sons and daughters speaking Chinese." Saudi educational experts claim that the language will become a language of great impact in the future. Saudi Arabia recently saw a great influx of Chinese investments, and they claim that knowing the language will greatly enhance trade and knowledge. But according to me, the recent friendship between China and Saudi Arabia is concerning, as both countries have terrible human rights records, and Saudi Arabia is extremely efficient at squashing any form of dissidence. So needless to say, if both countries start taking a page from each other on how to successfully run a dictatorship, it will be terrible news for the citizens of both the countries and the world in general. If you liked and shared the video, be sure to drop a like. And if you have any comments or stories that you'll like us to cover, let us know in the comments below. If you want to stay updated on the happenings of China, be sure to subscribe and ring the bell icon so you never miss an upload from China Explained. Until the next episode, goodbye and thank you for watching.